The message came at dawn. It wasn't a broadcast. It wasn't a transmission on open channels. It was a needle of code fired straight into the orbital defense network, bypassing every firewall like it was nothing. A simple voice, calm, alien, and cold, spoke only 13 words. Kneel, humanity, and live. Stand, and your world will burn to cinders. I was on the command deck of the ISS Sentinel, sipping black coffee so bitter it could melt hull plating, when the words rolled through the speakers. Nobody spoke for several seconds. We just stood there, the hum of the reactor suddenly sounding a lot louder than it should. The data came in seconds later. Origin point somewhere near Epsilon Eridani. The signature wasn't from any known trader or civilian ship. No, this was a military packet. Big, structured, a war machine's calling card. I'd been in the fleet long enough to recognize the unspoken part of that message. They weren't negotiating. This wasn't a maybe war. It was the kind of demand predators make when they're already circling you, teeth bared. Earth's High Council did what politicians always do. They talked. Meetings, debates, committees, the kind of bureaucratic paralysis that gets men killed. I didn't have time for that. Neither did my crew. We'd been prepping for this day for years. The public thought the Black Armada was just a rumor, whispers about a shadow fleet with no registry, no nation flag, operating outside Earth's treaties. They weren't wrong. The fleet existed, all right, but only in the kind of classified files you opened once and never mentioned again. We didn't take orders from the Council. We didn't defend territory. We defended the species. And when someone told humanity to kneel, we made damn sure they learned what a bad idea that was. I keyed the secure channel, my voice flat but sharp enough to cut steel. Black Armada Command, this is Sentinel-1. Lock and load. We're moving. No confirmation came back. We didn't need one. The order meant every hidden dockyard, every deep space vault, every black site shipyard buried in asteroid belts would light up and start bringing monsters to life. The aliens, whoever they were, thought they were facing Earth's standing fleets. They'd never heard of ships like the Iron Revenant or the Void Reaper. They didn't know we had vessels with hull plating grown from nanosteel composites that could survive a direct nuclear strike. They didn't know about rail cannons, so big the recoil could crack a moon in half. We were built for one thing: war without rules. Still, even as the coordinates streamed in and the fleet's ghost signals began blinking across the sector map, I knew this wouldn't be easy. We didn't know their numbers, we didn't know their tech, and worst of all, we didn't know their endgame. But I knew one thing: you don't send a threat like that to humanity and expect us to bow. We'd burned our own cities before surrendering to tyranny. We destroyed our own colonies rather than let enemies claim them. We didn't do kneeling. The fleet came online within hours. Hundreds of ships, some the size of mountains, others sleek as blades, slipped out of hiding, converging on our rendezvous point in the shadow of Neptune. The stars around us disappeared under a tide of black hulls. Looking at them, I felt the old fire in my chest. This wasn't defense. This wasn't survival. This was a message. They wanted us to kneel? We'd teach them what it meant to choke on your own arrogance. The jump corridor spat us out into the cold gulf between Neptune's shadow and the Kuiper Belt. The view ahead was nothing but a scatter of frozen rock and the glint of distant stars. But I knew what was gathering there. The Black Armada didn't need fanfare or banners. Its presence was written in the way the void itself seemed to bend around it. Ship after ship emerged from deep space drift, some cutting in from far-off systems, others crawling out of hidden construction bays buried in ice asteroids. The largest was the Iron Revenant, a warship so massive it made my Sentinel feel like a tugboat. Her black hull absorbed light, making her seem like a jagged absence carved into space. Even her heat signature was muted, designed to vanish from enemy sensors until it was too late. On her flanks drifted predators of every shape, needle-shaped frigates armed with spinal mount railguns, heavy carriers with cavernous bays for dropships and gunboats, stealth cruisers that didn't appear on your scanners until they were already drilling holes in your hull. And somewhere among them were the ghost ships, unregistered, crewless, running on AI minds older than some colonies. Those ones didn't even look like ships so much as shadows moving against the starfield. We didn't have an admiral. We had a war council. No hierarchy, no politics, just captains with blood on their hands and victories in their logs. Our orders were simple. Break the enemy before they reached Earth. I opened a link to the War Council channel. "This is Captain Harlan," I said. "Sentinel reporting full combat readiness. What's our intel on the Epsilon Eridani threat?" A gruff voice cut in. Captain Drex of the Void Reaper. "Minimal. Long-range probes caught the tail end of their formation before we lost the feed. Could be a fleet, could be a probe screen, but the packet they sent? That was military-grade intimidation. Whoever they are, they've fought wars before." Another voice, Captain Rorton from the Ash Vulture, chimed in. "And they expect us to fold. Means they either have overwhelming numbers, or they think they do." I grunted. "Either way, we hit them first. No drawn-out defenses. If they want to dictate terms, we make damn sure they can't." "Agreed," Drex said. "No quarter, no survivors." The channel went silent for a few beats, and then coordinates began streaming to every ship. An intercept course, plotted not toward Earth's colonies, but straight into deep interstellar void. We were going to meet them where there were no witnesses, no civilians, just black space and cold steel. It took us 6 days to reach the strike point. 6 days in which every crewman aboard every ship knew exactly what was coming. There were no green recruits in the Armada. We didn't take them. Everyone here had fought at least one war. Some had fought in half a dozen. Some had lost everything. On the second day, we caught the first signal pings. Short, sharp, and encrypted in a format that didn't belong to any known galactic faction. Their ships weren't broadcasting identifiers. That told me 2 things. They were predators, and they were operating outside anyone's laws, just like us. On day 4, one of our stealth scouts, the Wraith's dagger, went dark. No explosion, no distress beacon, just gone. Our sensors recorded a faint spatial distortion right before the feed cut, like space itself had hiccuped. That night, I stood alone in the Sentinel's forward observation deck, watching the stars slide past. I'd been in space for 30 years, and I'd never seen a distortion like that. It wasn't a jump signature. It wasn't a weapon discharge. It felt wrong, like something was moving in a way it shouldn't be able to. On day 6, we saw them. At first, they were just shadows, specks of black against the black, moving in tight formation. Then the sensors started picking them up, and every crewman on the deck went quiet. They weren't ships, not in any human sense. Each one looked like an obsidian shard, jagged and irregular, as if they'd been carved from some ancient crystal. They moved without visible thrusters, just gliding through the void like sharks through deep water. They weren't reflecting light. They were swallowing it. And their formation, gods, their formation was perfect. No deviation, no drift. "Contact," the sensor officer called. 57 signatures. Largest is 2 kilometers long. 2 clicks. That was bigger than the Iron Revenant. The War Council opened the channel without waiting for pleasantries. "They're not broadcasting," Drex said. "Not even to threaten us." "They think we're already dead," Rorton said. I leaned forward in my chair. "Let's prove them wrong." The Armada broke formation, each ship sliding into its assigned attack vector. We were still well beyond weapons range, but railgun capacitors were charging, missile bays opening, plasma batteries humming to life. The enemy didn't react, didn't accelerate, didn't spread out, just kept coming. Then, Without warning, 3 of their smaller shards peeled away and vanished. Not jumped, not cloaked, just gone. A heartbeat later, alarms screamed across my deck. "They're inside our perimeter!" 3 enemy craft reappeared less than 2,000 meters off our bow. The Sentinel's point defense guns fired automatically, tracers tearing across the void, but the rounds passed straight through the alien ships like they were shooting smoke. "Shields to full!" I barked. "Target with pulse beams!" Our forward batteries lit up the darkness, beams cutting clean lines across their forms. For a moment, they shimmered like heat haze, and then they were solid again, but not intact. Chunks of black crystal drifted away from one of them, glowing faintly like molten glass. It didn't explode, it just stopped moving, drifting like a corpse in the dark. The other 2 vanished again before we could fire. That was the moment I realized the danger we were in. These things weren't just ships. They were weapons in themselves, slipping in and out of reality like they were cheating the laws of physics. The Council came back online, voices sharp. "We can't let them pick us apart," Drex snapped. "Full offensive. Push through their center before they flank us." I knew what he meant. In naval warfare, the center was usually the most heavily armed, and if we broke it, their formation would collapse. It was the kind of move you made when you didn't care about casualties. The Armada roared forward. The first volley hit them like a hammer. Railgun slugs tore through their front ranks, some shattering instantly, others cracking and drifting apart. Our missile swarms followed, detonating in blinding white blossoms that lit the void. But they weren't just taking the hits, they were learning. The second wave of missiles never reached them, vanishing mid-flight, reappearing hundreds of kilometers away, detonating harmlessly in empty space. And then they hit back. It wasn't gunfire. It wasn't missiles. It was light. Thin, precise beams of white-gold energy, so narrow you could mistake them for scanner pings, until they sliced through an entire carrier from bow to stern. The Ash Vulture died in seconds, splitting apart into 2 burning halves. I didn't have time to mourn Rorden. "Evasive pattern Sigma," I shouted, and the Sentinel rolled hard to port, avoiding a beam that scorched the vacuum where we'd been a heartbeat earlier. The Armada was bleeding ships, but we were still pushing. The Iron Revenant plowed through their line, her main railgun firing a slug the size of a cargo shuttle straight into the 2-kilometer flagship. The impact cracked it open like an egg, spilling some kind of liquid fire into space. That's when I saw it. Inside the cracked flagship wasn't machinery, it wasn't metal, it was alive. The shards weren't ships at all, they were something else entirely. And for the first time in a long, bloody career, I felt something I hadn't felt since my first battle. Fear. The thing inside the cracked flagship moved, not in the way machines moved, no cold precision, no mechanical joints, but with a slow, deliberate flex, like muscle and sinew bending under pressure. A rippling mass of blackened flesh, webbed with faintly glowing veins of molten gold, pulsed inside the jagged crystal hull. It had no eyes that I could see, yet I felt its attention sweep across the battlefield like a spotlight. My stomach tightened. We'd been shooting at warships. Now I realized we'd been stabbing a predator in its armor. The Iron Revenant fired again, another slug hammering into the exposed core. The impact tore more of the black crystal away, and the thing inside let out a sound. Not through comms, not through the vacuum, but in my head. A low, resonant hum that made my teeth ache. I gritted them and shook it off, but some of my crew clutched their heads and staggered. One dropped to his knees. Blood leaking from his nose. "They're broadcasting," my comms officer said, his voice trembling. "Not language, not sound. It's interference inside the brain." The thing inside the flagship uncoiled, pushing against its crystal shell, until the remaining hull split apart like glass under strain. The entire shard was just discarded. What floated free was a leviathan of black gold muscle, limbs too many to count, each tipped with blades that looked more like bone than metal. It moved with terrifying grace, no thrusters, no reaction jets, just will, and it was big, bigger than the Sentinel, maybe bigger than the Revenant. "Contact, incoming," the sensor officer shouted. I didn't need the warning. The thing lunged, closing the gap between it and the Iron Revenant in seconds. It didn't fire weapons. It didn't need to. One blade limb swung, and the Revenant's starboard hull split open like a tin can. Atmosphere vented in a violent plume. And I caught glimpses of crew, our crew, spinning away into the black. The Revenant answered with point-blank plasma fire, streams of searing white energy burning into the creature's hide. Chunks of it boiled away, but it didn't stop. If anything, it moved faster. Then it screamed. This time the sound was in both the ship's audio feed and in my skull. A ripping, alien shriek that made the deck plates hum. Systems flickered. Lights died. For 3 full seconds, the Sentinel's instruments went blind. By the time they came back, the Iron Revenant was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. No debris. No heat signature. Just empty space where the largest warship in the Armada had been. Drex's voice roared over the War Council channel. "All ships, disengage! This isn't a fleet battle, it's a slaughter!" He was right. The other shards were opening now, crystal shells splitting to release more of those things. Dozens of them. Each moved differently. Some like eels through water. Some like beasts running across an invisible plain, but all of them with the same black gold bodies, the same bladed limbs. "They're alive," I said aloud, though no one had asked. "The ships were just shells." We'd been fighting an army of living weapons, and they weren't here to conquer. They were here to hunt. The Sentinel's engines roared as I ordered maximum burn. Around us, other Armada ships were breaking formation, some trying to regroup, others going to full retreat. But the enemy didn't pursue like a conventional fleet. They didn't target ships in the rear or focus on crippling engines. They moved like predators picking off prey, singling out stragglers, hitting them with overwhelming force, then vanishing before another target could react. I caught sight of the blade of Orion trying to cover the retreat. She was a heavy destroyer, all forward-facing firepower, and she made it count. Her railguns tore one of the creatures in half, sending molten tissue spinning into the void. But even as her crew cheered, 2 more came out of nowhere, one above and one below, and the blade was gone in seconds. "Helm, get us under that ice cluster," I barked, pointing to a massive fragment of frozen rock drifting ahead. "We'll use it as cover." The Sentinel swung hard, thrusters screaming as we ducked behind the glacial mass. For a few precious moments, the chaos of the battle faded. Then Drex came on comms. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind it. "We can't outrun them, not all of us. If we scatter, they'll pick us off. We hold the line here, behind cover, and hit them when they come." It was suicide, but it was also the only way anyone was making it out alive. The War Council's feed was smaller now, half the ships that had been in it when the battle started. Nobody argued. We formed up along the ice cluster's shadow, weapons tracking the void beyond. The creatures didn't rush us. They were patient. Watching. Waiting. Minutes dragged. The crew shifted restlessly. My knuckles ached from how tightly I was gripping the arm of my chair. Then, in the far distance, I saw it. A faint distortion in the starfield. Not movement, more like a ripple. "Contact," my sensor officer whispered, as if speaking too loudly would draw them closer. The ripple became a shadow. The shadow became a shape. The first creature emerged into our trap, gliding silently into range. Fire. Every ship opened up at once. Rail slugs, plasma bolts, missile salvos, everything we had tore into it. It shuddered, parts of its body bursting apart under the barrage. It didn't get the chance to scream before it was nothing but drifting chunks of black and gold. Cheers erupted over the comms. But I didn't join them, because the sensors had just picked up 6 more distortions. They came at us like wolves breaking into a pen. The ice cluster lit up as plasma fire cut through its surface, sending shards spinning into the void. Ships broke formation, dodging and weaving. The Sentinel rolled hard, one of the blade limbs missing our port side by meters. We killed 2 more in the next minute, lost 4 ships doing it. And then, just like that, they were gone. Not retreating, not destroyed. Vanished. Silence fell. The only sound was the hum of the engines and the distant groan of the ice cluster shifting in space. "They're pulling back," Drex said, disbelief in his voice. "No," I said, the hairs on my neck standing on end. "They're circling." He didn't argue, because deep in the black, the ripples were coming again, only this time there were dozens. They came from every direction at once. The ripples in the void flared into shapes, each one blooming into a predator of black muscle and gold-veined armor. Not the neat formations of fleets. This was chaos with purpose. They swarmed like a pack that had been holding back, testing us, and had finally decided we were worth killing. "Brace for full assault," I barked. "Target closest threats, concentrate fire, don't chase." The first impact wasn't gunfire. It was the Wraith's spine, one of our stealth corvettes, being slammed bodily into the ice cluster. The hull split in half, her drive core detonating in a bloom of white light. The explosion tore a hole in the ice, chunks of frozen rock scattering across the battlefield like shrapnel. Through the glare, I caught sight of 3 of the things cutting straight for us. They moved with impossible precision, one high, one low, one dead ahead. The Sentinel's railguns roared, slugs smashing into the lead creature's head and punching straight through. It reeled but didn't stop. Plasma batteries joined in, carving molten wounds along its torso until finally it broke apart, bleeding black fluid that crystallized instantly in the cold. The other 2 didn't break stride. One swept under us, a bladed limb scraping the length of our keel. The metal screaming under the force. Warnings lit up my display, hull breach on decks 4 through 6, emergency bulkheads sealing. The second hit us dead on. Not a ram, more like it clung to us. I felt the shudder through the entire ship as it latched on, claws biting deep into the hull. "They're boarding!" the security chief shouted. I didn't waste time with orders to the crew. They already knew what to do. The Sentinel wasn't a carrier. We didn't have Marines in parade armor. Every man on board carried a rifle for exactly this reason. "Bridge to all decks," I said into the shipwide. "We're not dying quiet. Arm up and cut them down." By the time I reached the forward corridor, the deck lights were already flashing red, bulkhead sirens wailing. I could feel the thing on the hull, its weight shifting as it tore its way inward. The breach came with a scream of metal and a burst of air sucked into vacuum before the emergency fields slammed into place. And then it was inside. Up close, it was worse than the sensors had shown. The black armor wasn't smooth. It was layered, jagged, more like bone than plating. The gold veins pulsed in rhythm, like blood moving under skin. It had no face, just a cluster of fissures that split open to reveal rows of something like teeth. Except they moved. It came at us without hesitation. The first volley of gunfire tore chunks from its limbs, but it didn't slow. I sidestepped as it swung, its bladed arm carving through the wall like butter. The recoil from my rifle kicked hard into my shoulder as I emptied a full magazine into its chest. The rounds sparked, some lodging deep, some punching through. Black fluid sprayed in thick drops that sizzled against the deck plating. One of my men, Tovik, lunged with a shock pike, jamming the sparking tip into one of its glowing veins. The creature jerked violently, emitting a noise that made my ears pop. Tovik didn't let go. The thing's other limb came around like a whip and sent him crashing into the bulkhead hard enough to dent it. We kept firing. Finally, the creature staggered, its limbs twitching, and collapsed in a heap that steamed in the recycled air. The stink of it was thick and acrid, like burning tar mixed with copper. "Deck secure," I panted, checking my rifle. "Move the wounded to medbay. Everyone else, lock down the breach point. This isn't the last one." It wasn't. All across the fleet, reports were coming in. The creatures weren't just tearing ships apart from the outside, they were forcing their way inside. Once in, they didn't just kill, they took. Crews were being dragged off, still alive, kicking and screaming. The lucky ones were killed on the spot. The unlucky ones, we didn't know. The War Council channel was chaos. Shouted orders, death screams, static from ships going dark. Drex's voice cut through like a knife. "New priority, stop them from taking prisoners. You see one of our people in their grip, you put a round through the hostage if you have to. We're not feeding them." The cold edge in his tone told me exactly how many of his crew had already been taken. Back on the bridge, I saw the battle shifting. We were killing them, yes, but not fast enough. Every kill cost us another ship. The ice cluster we'd used for cover was half vaporized, its remains drifting as jagged shards. Debris fields from destroyed Armada ships glinted in the distance. "Sir," my sensor officer yelled, "we've got movement, larger than anything else so far." The display lit up with a new contact, and my chest tightened. It was massive, easily 3 kilometers long, and unlike the others, it wasn't cloaked in crystal armor. This one was all flesh and bone, writhing with dozens of limb-like protrusions, each one as long as a destroyer. The smaller creatures scattered as it approached, like wolves making way for the alpha. Drex came back on comms. "That's their command beast. Take it down, we might break the pack." We formed a spearhead, every surviving ship swinging toward the monster. The Sentinel's railguns spat round after round, the recoil shaking the deck. Missile salvos streaked ahead, detonating across its hide in bursts of white and orange. Plasma fire raked across its surface, carving glowing trenches into its flesh. It roared, a deep, thrumming sound that rattled bulkheads, and then surged forward. The Vulture's pride, a heavy cruiser, was the first to meet it head-on. She rammed one of her plasma lances straight into its central mass, the beam burning through meters of tissue. For a second, it looked like she might punch through. Then the monster wrapped 2 limbs around her and pulled. The Vulture's pride split in half like wet paper. We didn't stop firing. Couldn't. The only choice now was kill it before it killed all of us. It came for us next. I could see the ragged texture of its flesh on the forward cams, the way its limbs rippled as they swung. I braced for impact. And then, from above, Drex's Void Reaper dropped into the fight. Her forward drives burned hot, throwing her into a suicide dive straight at the beast's head. "Drex, don't," I started, but the comm cut. The Void Reaper hit with everything she had. Rail slugs, plasma bursts, a full missile rack, and then her core went critical. The explosion lit up the void like a new star. The shockwave slammed the Sentinel sideways, alarms screaming. When the glare faded, the command beast was missing half its head. The remaining creatures screamed in unison, a sound that carried not through the air, but through my bones. And then they fled. Not in disarray, no panic, just withdrawal, like they'd gotten what they came for or had lost interest. The surviving shards peeled away into the dark, their massive forms fading into the void. Silence fell, broken only by the faint crackle of the comms. The fleet was in ruins. Less than a third of the Armada remained. Hulls burned, wreckage drifted, and the void swallowed the bodies of the dead. We'd won nothing. We'd just survived. For now, the battlefield was quiet in the way a graveyard is quiet. Our ships drifted like wounded animals, hulls pitted and torn, trailing atmosphere in long, thin ribbons that glittered against the distant starlight. The Black Armada had been reduced to shadows of itself, barely 30 ships still operational, most of them limping along on backup systems. The Sentinels' decks smelled like burnt metal and ozone. Emergency welders worked in the corridors, sealing breaches, patching scorched walls, dragging out twisted heaps of plating where bulkheads had collapsed. Medbays were overflowing. We had wounded lying in cargo bays on makeshift cots, hooked up to portable life support units. But worse than the wounded were the missing. They didn't leave corpses. If a man died in the fight, you found what was left: charred armor, torn limbs, sometimes nothing more than a frozen smear on the deck. But the ones they took, they were just gone. Whole squads ripped from sealed compartments, even with the bulkheads still intact. I walked the lower decks, listening to the crews talk in hushed voices. Nobody used the word captured. Captured implied you were still alive in a way that could be fixed. This felt different. This felt permanent. We needed answers. We started with the wreckage. There wasn't much. Most of their crystal shells had shattered into shards no bigger than a shuttle. The bodies of the smaller creatures had broken apart after death, their black flesh turning brittle and flaking away into dust. But a few chunks of the command beast still floated in the debris field, pieces big enough to tractor in. The science teams worked in sealed hangars, wearing full hazard armor. Every scrap we brought aboard was treated like an unexploded warhead. The black gold flesh was still warm, days after the battle. It didn't bleed in the normal sense. Fluid seeped from it in a slow, syrup-like ooze that hardened into a glassy shell when exposed to air. One of the pieces wasn't just flesh. It had structures, tubes, sacs, and what looked disturbingly like cartilage. Inside one of the sacs, they found something small, curled, pale, and humanoid. The medics thought it was a deformed embryo at first, but the proportions were wrong. Too long in the arms, the hands tipped with the same jagged claws as the larger beasts. Its skin was translucent, showing faint traces of gold-veined channels under the surface, and its face, if you could call it that, was almost human. Almost. I stood there staring at it while the lead xenobiologist explained in a voice that trembled despite the helmet filter. It's not a fetus. It's fully developed. Just dormant, preserved. Whatever these things are, they carry these with them. Maybe they're young. Maybe they're something else. It looked dead. But then one of its hands twitched. We vented it into space before anyone could argue. The real clue came from the Grave Walker, one of our stealth frigates that had barely survived the fight. She'd been trailing a disabled shard after the battle, keeping her distance, when she picked up faint transponder pings. Not alien. Human. We followed the coordinates. The shard had drifted several thousand clicks from the battle site, caught in the gravitational pull of a shattered moon. It was dead. No heat signature, no movement. But there was a rupture in the hull large enough to send a boarding team through. I went myself. I don't send men into unknowns I won't walk into. The inside was worse than I expected. No clean corridors or ship compartments, just a honeycomb of organic tunnels, the walls slick and pulsing faintly like muscle fiber. Our boots stuck slightly with every step, the surface tacky underfoot. The air was heavy with a smell I couldn't place, sweet, metallic, and rotten all at once. We found them in the third chamber. Prisoners. They were suspended from the ceiling in translucent sacs, each one filled with a clear fluid that refracted our helmet lights in warped rainbows. Most of the shapes inside were human. Some wore Black Armada uniforms. Some were civilians from colonies I didn't recognize. They were alive. I could see their chests moving slowly, their eyes flickering under closed lids. But their skin was pale, almost waxy, and gold lines had begun to creep under the surface, tracing along veins and arteries. We cut one down. The sack tore with a wet sound, spilling fluid across the deck. The man inside collapsed into our arms, coughing weakly. His eyes opened, and they glowed faintly gold for a moment before fading back to normal. "Where? Am I?" he rasped. We didn't have time to answer before the walls shook. Something else was in the shard. It came fast, too fast for something its size. A smaller beast, maybe 10 meters long, its limbs folding and unfolding in ways that made my stomach turn. It didn't charge us like the ones in the battle. It went straight for the prisoners still hanging in the sacks. It wasn't rescuing them. It was finishing whatever had been started. We opened fire. The chamber exploded with gunfire, muzzle flashes reflecting off the wet walls. The creature darted between us, its limbs slicing through the air, nicking armor, scoring sparks off helmets. One swipe caught Hayes, one of my riflemen, across the torso. Armor peeled back like foil. And he was gone in a spray of red. I dropped to one knee, sighted along my rifle, and put a full burst into the thing's head. Black fluid sprayed, coating the walls, and it went down, twitching. We grabbed the rescued man and got the hell out. No time for the others. Not with the walls starting to close. Yes, close. The organic tunnels constricted behind us as we ran, walls flexing inward like a throat swallowing. By the time we reached the breach, the opening had shrunk by half. We dove through into the void, our suits' thrusters firing as we drifted back to the Sentinel. The shard collapsed in on itself minutes later, folding like wet paper until it was no bigger than a shuttle, and then it simply winked out of existence. The rescued man, Lieutenant Brannock, engineering officer from the Ash Vulture, wasn't right. At first he was just quiet. He ate, he slept, he answered questions, though his voice was flat, like he was talking through a fog. But on the second day, he started humming. Low, rhythmic, almost inaudible. The medics thought it was a stress response until the ship's comm array started picking up faint pulses on the same frequency. When I asked him about it, he looked at me with those pale eyes and said, "They're still out there. They know where we are." We moved him to isolation. The War Council met aboard the Sentinel's mess deck, the only room big enough to hold us and still keep the surviving captains in one place. Nobody looked like they'd slept. I laid it out straight. They don't just kill, they take people. They do something to them, something that changes them. We've got at least 100 crew unaccounted for, and I think we can assume they're in the same condition as Brannock. If they finish whatever they're doing, they turn them into those things, one of the captains finished. Nobody disagreed. Drex was gone. Half the council was dead. The rest of us knew we couldn't fight them in open space again, not with the numbers we had left. We needed to know where they came from, how they moved, and most importantly, how to stop whatever they were doing to the prisoners. Our sensor chief had one lead, a trace signal buried in the distortion logs from the battle. A location. Not a system, exactly, but a region of dead space between mapped sectors. The kind of place predators make their den. When we left the battlefield, we didn't head back to Earth. We didn't send reports. We went dark, no beacons, no comms, running on cold engines. Because if those things had a home, we were going to find it. And we weren't going there to talk. We ran dark for 9 days. No transponders, no comm chatter, no heat emissions beyond what our cold sinks could swallow. The Sentinel and the remnants of the Black Armada slipped through the black like ghosts, following the distortion trail the sensor chief had pulled from the battle logs. I didn't tell the crew where we were headed until we were halfway there. Men fight harder when they think they're moving towards survival. This wasn't survival. This was suicide with coordinates. By day 7, the crew knew anyway. They could see it in my face. The region on the charts was nothing but a blank void. No stars, no planets, not even the usual scattering of ice and rock you'd expect in deep space. The readings showed a gravitational dead zone. No pull from any direction, as if something in there was eating it. The distortion grew stronger the deeper we went. It didn't look like normal jump space eddies. It looked like ripples in the skin of reality itself, shivering out from a single point far ahead. We broke out of dark space at the edge of a hollow sphere in the void. That's when we saw it. The nest. It wasn't a structure. It wasn't a planet. It was alive. A sphere. Easily 500 kilometers across, floating in the dark. Its surface was the same black gold flesh as the beasts we'd fought, veined with slow pulses of molten light. Massive spines jutted outward, some as long as entire battleships, rotating slowly like antennae listening to something we couldn't hear. The whole thing breathed. Not metaphorically, not visually. It moved, rising and falling with a rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand up. The Armada went silent. Nobody spoke over comms. Nobody needed to. Every man staring at the display knew we were looking at the source. "That's not a base," muttered Captain Harlow of the Broken Fang. "That's a damn queen." It wasn't just the sphere. Orbiting it in slow patterns were hundreds, no, thousands of the crystal shards we'd fought before, each one drifting like a dormant wasp in a hive. Some were small as corvettes, some dwarfed the Iron Revenant. And the signals. The background hum we'd been tracing wasn't just coming from the sphere. It was layered, thousands of overlapping pulses, all beating in sync with that slow, steady breathing. I realized then what had been nagging me since Brannock started humming back on the Sentinel. It was a heartbeat. We kept our distance, running scans through every filter we had. The sphere's surface wasn't solid. Here and there we caught glimpses of openings, wet, circular maws big enough to swallow destroyers whole. Smaller tunnels branched out between them, swarming with movement. It wasn't random movement. They were working, building. The deeper scans picked up masses moving along the surface, some of them clearly the beasts we'd fought, others smaller, shaped more like men, but wrong in the way Brannock was wrong. Then we saw them. The prisoners. They were walking in lines along the outer spines, naked, skin pale under the faint gold veins that crawled under the surface. They moved without hesitation. Without struggle, carrying objects toward the maws in the sphere's surface. Some of them were Black Armada crew. I recognized uniforms from the Ash Vulture, the Blade of Orion, even the Void Reaper. Men I'd seen fight and bleed beside me were now part of that. "Dear God," my XO whispered. We didn't have the luxury of God out here. The War Council met on a secured frequency. "We can't hit this head-on," Harlow said. "We'd be ash before we broke the first layer of defense." "They're making more," I said. "Those prisoners, they're part of the process. The Queen's breeding them, changing them. Every hour we sit here, there are more of those things out in the galaxy." "Then what's the play?" "We burn it." Silence. Then slow nods across the council feed. The only way to kill something that big was from the inside. We had one weapon that could do it. A Mark 7 singularity charge. Illegal in every corner of human space, designed to fold a section of reality in on itself. We'd kept one locked in a vault aboard the Sentinel for years, waiting for the day we'd need to erase something so completely that even its atoms wouldn't remember existing. Problem was, you couldn't just fire it from a distance. The thing was too well shielded by whatever gravitational trick it was using to mask itself. The charge would have to be planted inside one of those surface maws, which meant someone had to go in. We chose 3 ships for the run: the Sentinel, the Broken Fang, and the stealth frigate Gravewalker. The rest of the Armada would hang back, ready to hit anything that came after us. We went in slow, using the debris drifting near the nest as cover. The shards ignored us at first, gliding in their lazy orbits. I wondered if they thought we were already theirs. We reached the nearest maw without a shot fired. It was worse up close. Its walls rippled like muscle fiber, slick with some kind of viscous fluid that steamed in the vacuum. The opening flexed slowly with each breath of the Queen, expanding and contracting like a throat. We waited for the inhale, then dove in. The maw swallowed us whole. Inside, the light was gold. Not bright, dim, diffuse, like sunlight filtered through deep water. The walls pulsed with slow waves of luminescence, guiding us deeper. Gravity shifted as we moved, pulling us toward the heart of the sphere. It wasn't empty. The tunnels were lined with growths, pods the size of escape shuttles, each one filled with fluid and a shape inside. Some were beasts, some were humanoid, some were in between. Brannock had been the beginning of something. This was the assembly line. We didn't have time to stop. The Sentinel pushed forward, engines straining against the shifting pull. Every kilometer we descended, the hum in my bones grew stronger, sinking with my heartbeat until I could barely tell them apart. Then the walls ahead opened into a chamber the size of a city. The heart. It hung suspended in the middle, an immense sack, glowing gold from within, cables of black flesh anchoring it to the walls. The heartbeat was deafening here. Each pulse sent a visible ripple through the chamber, making the walls flex. I didn't have to ask what was inside. The sheer scale told me. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of those creatures waiting to be born. We deployed the singularity charge at the chamber's base. The device was a matte black sphere barely a meter across, humming faintly as its arming sequence began. We had 5 minutes to get out. We turned for the exit, and the Queen noticed us. The walls around the chamber tore open, and limbs bigger than the Sentinel itself shot toward us. The whole chamber convulsed, trying to crush us where we floated. The Broken Fang took the first hit, her starboard side crumpling under the impact. She didn't slow. Her captain rammed her straight into one of the Queen's limbs, tearing it open in a spray of black and gold. "Go!" Harlow roared over comms. "Get it done!" We didn't look back. The Gravewalker wove ahead of us, her stealth fields flickering as she jammed the Queen's sensory pulses. The walls closed, limbs flailing, creatures spilling from pods to swarm the tunnels. The Sentinel's guns thundered non-stop, tearing holes just wide enough for us to slip through. We broke out of the maw with 30 seconds left on the charge. The explosion didn't look like an explosion. It looked like the universe tearing. The Queen convulsed, her entire surface shivering as a black sphere of nothingness bloomed from within, swallowing her flesh, her shards, her prisoners, everything. The singularity burned white at its edges, then collapsed inward with a sound I felt more than heard. When the light faded, the nest was gone. Just gone. No debris, no shards, no gold glow, only the cold black of space. The Armada didn't cheer. We'd done what we came to do, but the cost was carved into every face on every bridge. Harlow was gone. The Broken Fang was gone. Half the men who went into the maw never came out. And I couldn't shake the thought gnawing at the back of my skull. If this was just one nest, how many more were out there? We didn't head straight for Earth. The Armada needed time to patch what was left of itself. Engines were cracked, hulls torn. Life support on half the ships was running on emergency loops. We limped to a dead mining colony on the edge of the Luton system. one of those places the government had written off decades ago. The ore veins were tapped out, but the docks still worked, and the station's reactors still had a little bite left in them. For the first 2 days, it was just repairs and silence. No comms, no signals sent. We didn't know if the nest's destruction had made any difference, or if we'd just kicked a hornet's nest hard enough for the swarm to start moving. By the 3rd day, the silence broke. It came in bursts, fragmented transmissions from deep space relays, garbled by interference we couldn't trace. We pieced them together bit by bit until the story became clear. Earth was in chaos. The first reports were of ships vanishing on trade routes, not just patrol craft, bulk freighters, civilian liners, colony transports. No distress calls, no wreckage, just gone. Then came the riots. Footage from Mars and Ganymede showed crowds tearing through streets, smashing storefronts, fighting security forces. It wasn't protest, it was madness. People's eyes glowing faintly gold, their skin webbed with fine veins that pulsed under the surface. Brannock's face flashed in my mind. The worst came from Luna. A private shuttle crashed into the South Dome, breaching the atmosphere seal and killing nearly 300. The pilot's body was recovered. His DNA matched a man who'd been listed missing after a border skirmish 6 years ago. 6 years. Which meant they'd been taking people long before the demand to kneel, and they'd been sending them back. The War Council met in the Sentinel's mess. What was left of it anyway? 5 captains and me, no Drex, no Harlow, no easy choices. "They're here," Captain Rail said, her voice flat. "We were looking for nests out there, but they've been seeding them here, on our worlds." I didn't disagree. We saw how fast they can breed them. If they've been doing this on Earth and the colonies, we're already behind. Rail slammed a hand on the table. "We should have turned back the second we saw the gold in Brannock's eyes." "Too late for regrets," I said. "The question now is whether we hit them head-on or find where they're hiding first." Captain Juno from the Pale Mourner leaned forward. "If we storm in without proof, the Council will call us war criminals before we even make it to orbit. They'll claim it's some sickness, not an invasion. Then we get proof. We set a course for Earth. Not openly. We didn't want to announce the Armada's return until we were ready to show exactly what we'd seen. Our stealth ships moved ahead, dropping sensor drones in the asteroid belts and along the main jump lanes. That's when we caught the first one. A civilian freighter, the Morning Star, outbound from Titan to Earth. She wasn't broadcasting distress, but her transponder code was wrong. Half the digits were just missing. When the Gravewalker hailed her, the captain responded in a calm, polite tone and said his ship was operating normally. The Gravewalker's boarding team went over in full armor. They found the crew sitting at their stations, hands on the controls, eyes closed. Every single one of them was breathing in perfect sync. When the team tried to move them, they all opened their eyes at the same moment. Gold. The boarding team didn't even have time to fire before the crew moved. Not ran, not lunged, just moved. Smooth, fast, coordinated in a way that no human group ever is without training. And even then, not like this. 3 of our men were dead in the first second. The rest pulled back to the docking tube and blew the clamps. The Morning Star turned to pursue. The Gravewalker had to destroy her. By the time we reached Earth's orbit, the situation had worsened. The High Council had declared martial law, citing a coordinated terrorist bioweapon attack. Their broadcasts insisted everything was contained. But the orbital traffic lanes told a different story. Half the satellites were dark, military patrols were doubling up on every sector, and 2 civilian stations had been stripped of their crews entirely. The Sentinel stayed in high orbit while I went down to the surface with a hand-picked team. We didn't check in with the Council, we didn't wear uniforms. We headed for the south sectors of New London first, places where the riots had burned hottest. The streets were quiet now, but it wasn't peace. People moved in clusters, watching us with flat expressions. Some glanced at each other in ways that made my skin crawl, like they were passing messages without speaking. It was Brannock's eyes all over again. The real break came in the old dockyards. We'd been following a man who moved differently from the others, faster, too deliberate. He led us through abandoned warehouses to a cargo lift that descended far deeper than any dockyard needed to go. At the bottom, we found the tunnel. It wasn't man-made. The walls were slick, black, faintly gold-veined. The air was warm and heavy, carrying the same copper-sweet stench I'd smelled inside the shard in the Leuten system. It went down, a long way. We followed it until the tunnel opened into a chamber the size of a cathedral. Pods lined the walls. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Each one held a human. Some were just starting to show the gold veins. Others were almost fully changed. And at the center, half submerged in some kind of fluid, was one of the smaller beasts. It wasn't moving. Its chest rose and fell slowly, and thin tubes connected it to the pods around it. The man we'd followed stepped into the fluid without hesitation. His eyes went gold, and the tubes shifted, wrapping around his arms. He didn't scream. We'd seen enough. We pulled back fast, not daring to fire in case the sound brought more of them. Back on the surface, my team moved without speaking. Nobody needed to ask what we were thinking. This wasn't an invasion waiting to happen. It was already here. That night, the Sentinel went dark again. We pulled away from orbit, back to the edge of the system. The Armada was too small to hold Earth. The Council wouldn't believe us, or they'd silence us before we could speak. We had two options. We could watch Earth fall, or we could go underground, strike from the shadows, and start tearing out every nest we found until there was nothing left for them to grow from. I knew which one I'd choose. We stopped calling ourselves the Black Armada in public. In the Council's eyes, we were already ghosts. War criminals who had gone rogue in deep space. The official record said we'd been destroyed against unknown hostile forces, a polite euphemism for stop asking questions. That suited me fine. It's easier to kill a parasite when it doesn't know you've got a knife to its throat. The 30 ships that survived the nest were scattered across the system, moving between dead colonies, forgotten way stations, and asteroid fields thick enough to hide in. We cut comms to bursts of encrypted pulses so short they were almost indistinguishable from static. Every meeting was face-to-face, every supply run off the books. We didn't have a war anymore. We had a hunt. The first months were pure attrition. The gold-veined ones were spreading faster than we'd guessed. They weren't just rioters in the streets. They were in cargo crews, orbital dockyards, traffic control stations. Anyone in a position to move goods or people between worlds was a potential carrier, and they didn't all look like Brannock. Some were clean. No gold, no obvious change, until they were close enough to put a knife in your ribs. We learned to spot them anyway. They moved with a rhythm. Every step, every gesture synced to that same pulse we'd felt in the nest. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Our raids got surgical. We'd hit a warehouse on Ganymede, burn the pods before the drones could swarm, and vanish before the Council's enforcers arrived. We'd board a freighter in the belt, sweep for sleepers, and space them before their handlers even knew they were gone. It was ugly work. There were no prisoners, not after what happened to Brannock. By the third month, we started getting intelligence from an unlikely source, defectors. Some of the gold-veined ones could think for themselves. Not many, but a handful had resisted the full change. They said they could hear the Queen's call, but could still fight it. One of them, a dockyard worker named Cade, claimed he'd been half-taken on Europa before cutting himself free from the pod. He brought us our biggest lead, the location of the primary Earth nest. It wasn't deep underground like the one we'd found in New London. It was inside an orbital station, Station 9. a civilian hub that handled freight from the colonies to Earth. On paper, it was clean. In reality, Cade said, half the lower decks were already grown over with black gold flesh. More importantly, it was the network's heart in Sewell. Every shipment, every sleeper, every pod moving through human space passed through Station 9. Cut it out, and the infection would go blind and hungry. The Council of Captains, now just 4 of us, agreed. This was the final push. We couldn't hit it openly. The station's defenses would tear us apart before we got close. We'd go in disguised, 3 ships posing as bulk haulers on staggered approach vectors. Each would carry a team, no more than 30 men, to breach the lower decks and plant thermonuclear charges at the pod chambers. Once the charges were armed, the Armada would move in to cover our retreat, and the station would burn. It was suicide for someone. We just didn't know who yet. We came in under false registry codes, transponders faked by Cade's contacts. The docking bay was quiet, its crew moving with that too-perfect rhythm I'd learned to hate. None of them challenged us. They just waved us through like they already owned us. The lower decks were worse than Cade had described. The black gold growth had swallowed entire corridors, turning walls into pulsing, veined muscle. Pods were stacked 3 high, hundreds of them, each with a human inside. Some twitched in their sleep. Others lay perfectly still, gold already spreading through their veins like frost over glass. We moved fast, planting the charges in the biggest chambers. The explosives were old-fashioned nukes. No fancy singularities this time, just raw fire. Heat and light enough to turn the nest into ash. On the second chamber, we hit resistance. They didn't rush us with claws this time. They just appeared. Sleepers, dock workers, freight crew, maybe passengers, but their eyes were gold, their movements too smooth. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The first shot broke the silence. Then the whole deck erupted. I dropped one with a rifle burst to the chest, another with a shot to the head. My team fought in tight formation, back to back, covering each other as the sleepers surged from every corridor. It wasn't like fighting men. It was like fighting a tide. One of them got inside my guard, slamming into me with enough force to crack my armor plates. We went down hard. I felt his hands clamp around my helmet, trying to twist it off. I jammed my sidearm under his chin and fired. The back of his skull painted the wall behind him. We broke through to the last chamber and planted the final charge. That's when the walls started to breathe. The station wasn't just a nest. It was part of the Queen. The black gold flesh swelled and split, and smaller beasts poured out. Half the size of the ones we'd fought in space, but faster, their limbs bladed and dripping with the same viscous fluid. They came at us on all 4s, moving with jerks that made my eyes ache. We couldn't fight them all. I keyed the comm. All teams, charges armed. Pull back now. The response came in bursts of gunfire and screams. Half my men didn't make it to the docking bay. We sealed the hatch and burned out, the other 2 teams converging on their ships as the station's defense guns spun up. That's when the Armada came in. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Gravewalker, the Pale Mourner, the Ashen Blade, all the ships that were left, hit the station from 3 vectors at once. Rail slugs punched through the upper decks. Plasma batteries carved trenches in its hull. The station's guns barely got a shot off before they were slagged. We cleared the blast radius with 20 seconds to spare. The nukes went off in a silent flash that turned the whole lower half of the station into molten debris. The shockwave ripped the rest apart, scattering it into the void. Nothing survived. We didn't go back to Earth. The Council would call it terrorism. The news feeds would say we'd destroyed a civilian station, killed thousands of innocents. The truth wouldn't matter. It never does in war. But I knew this. For the first time in months, the pulse was gone. The constant background hum that had been gnawing at the back of my skull since the nest in Leuten. It was silent. We'd cut out the heart of the soul infection. 2 weeks later, Cade brought me a message. It wasn't on any frequency we used. It wasn't even a voice. Just a low, steady hum. Familiar, but different. Slower. I asked him how far it was coming from. He said, everywhere. I thought we'd burned the queen. Maybe we had. But queens aren't the only ones that breed. The Armada stayed dark. Not because we were hiding anymore. Because the war wasn't over. It was only just beginning.